Hey guys. Lately, I've been trying to understand the role and the origin of our fears. I spend so much time paralyzed by it, fear about my own future, fears related to the uncertainty of the future of the West, fear of experiencing fear. I've gotten a few public speaking requests recently that, although I'm very honored to have been considered, I know I am going to forego because I have a crippling fear of public speaking. I'm interviewing E. Michael Jones in a month or two, and I'm filled with fear about this too. I know that fear is impeding my ability to reach my full potential, but cannot seem to assuage it. I don't think I'm alone in this because the fears that I've adopted are multifaceted. It feels like a unique kind of dread is permeating each level of my psyche. The ones that I mentioned earlier, public speaking, fears about my future, fear of interviewing someone in a higher intellectual stratosphere, those are more superficial. I think they're related to protecting my ego, my cultivated persona, my self-image, me. But the broader fears that are impacting us as a society, the more existential ones like fearing our cultural demise or our extinction, are really what I want to focus on today. There's a psychologist and an author, Dr. Carl Albrecht, that has written extensively about the fears that all humans share. I've linked an article summarizing some of his work below. He hypothesizes that there are 5 primary fears that are ubiquitous to humanity. He explains that while fear is a biological reaction caused by an anticipated or imagined event or experience, it really is just information. It offers us insight into threats, real or imagined. It really is up to us to differentiate. He says that our 5 basic fears are extinction. This is more than the fear of death. It's a fear of not being. Mutilation, this is more biological, the threat of losing bodily integrity to animals, disease, etc. Loss of autonomy, the fear of being immobilized, restricted, imprisoned by circumstances beyond our control. Separation, the fear of abandonment, rejection, and loss of connectedness, of becoming a non-person. And ego death, the fear of humiliation, shame, or any other mechanism of profound self-disapproval that threatens the loss of integrity of the self. I think this breakdown touches on most of the pervasive fears that are manifesting in modern society. On the left, we're seeing a rise of erratic behavior rooted in this fear of racism, sexism, all the isms, which has, of course, become something of an ever-expanding witch hunt since humans innately have a proclivity to choose that which is similar or familiar. We see this freak show parade of angry, gender-confused, indoctrinated youth like Antifa or young militant feminists that embody so much emotional turbulence that they default to violence. We have a hard time understanding this because it seems so insane from the standpoint of reason and evidence, but this really is just a fear response. It's a fear of extinction since alternative lifestyles are counter-propagative. It's a fear of loss of autonomy since they view the right as encroaching on their freedoms. It's a fear of separation and abandonment because they have formed interconnected groups of ostensibly marginalized communities that are actually philosophically at odds, like Muslims and LGBTQ folks. There's this inherent instability, and paired with this perceived external threat from the right, it elicits this reflexive, violent reaction. And most characteristic of these fear responses to leftists is that of ego death. They're insecure about the morality of their positions, so they're particularly obsessed with a rejection of shame and humiliation, irrespective of their position. See late-term abortion advocates and rabid shout your abortion feminists. Many of the same fears have manifested on the right, although from a rational perspective, these fears are clearly more legitimate. Ironically, this political dichotomy is roused by an identical biological impetus. For advocates of Western civilization, extinction is a giant fear. We're in the midst of our cultural demise, our demographic demise, and this causes a huge amount of existential anxiety, nihilism, and fear. Similarly, our loss of autonomy causes great anxiety. We've lost border integrity in most Western nations. We're being enveloped by a degenerate culture and restricted by an overreaching government. And many Westerners rightly feel that they've lost the right to self-determination, which is a fundamental right for all groups. The fear of separation on the right is also acute, but I believe this source is different from that of the left. It's this concept of being unpersoned, stamped out, removed from the conversation, which of course happens on a daily basis. I am amazed. I still have a YouTube channel. I got the boot from Twitter like a year and a half ago. But it's more than that for people on the right, since the dominant cultural narrative still favors leftist viewpoints. I made a video a while back called How to Survive Character Assassination. It's linked below, in which I discuss what it's like to be a pariah for stating plainly observable facts. Check out the comment section in that video. Hundreds of people have stories of their own rejection and how that affected their psyche. As humans, we need to cooperate with one another. We need to have social groups. Loneliness causes a multitude of adverse psychological outcomes. So for your average person, being alienated from their community, being painted as a bad person or a racist, has a deleterious effect that may reverberate through the rest of their life. I think on the right, we're a little more resilient than the left to the fear of ego death, since we're used to being chewed up and spit out by the media and a variety of other institutions and groups. We're not immune, no one is, but there is a level of hardiness that develops in counterculture movements. No matter, all fears, whether organic or manufactured, to some degree control our decision-making process. According to Dr. Gregory Burns, a neuroscientist at Emory University, fear turns off the exploratory and risk-taking functions of your brain, so you're only able to react defensively, preventing you from assessing all your options and making smarter decisions. We also have a tendency to revert to the worst case scenario and to let that guide our decision making. I've linked a very good TED Talk below, nearly flawless, except she had to add some climate change nonsense at the end there, wherein the lecturer discusses the role of fear and tells the story of the men on the Essex, which is the ship that inspired Herman Melville's Moby Dick. The Essex was an American whaling ship that in 1820 was rammed by a giant sperm whale and sank. All 20 crewmen initially survived and piled into 3 smaller boats with some supplies and some food. But upon the impact of the main ship, they had to make a decision about where they were going to go. They were 1,200 miles from the nearest land, the Marquesas Islands, but some of the crew were convinced that these islands were populated with cannibals. Instead, they decided to take a 4,000-mile journey against the winds and the currents to Peru or Chile. One of the boats was capsized by a killer whale, food and supplies ran out, and 3 sailors decided to stay on an island that they came across on their way south. For those that continued on the voyage, they died one by one from starvation, disease, dehydration, and after one crew member went mad and perished, his organs and flesh were cut from his body and eaten by the remaining sailors. After nearly 90 days at sea, the men that were left were rescued by passing ships, as were the men that remained on the island, but not before many of the other sailors were cannibalized. There were 8 survivors. It was the fear of being cannibalized, which ended up being nothing more than lore, that led them to make the irrational decision to travel such an unnecessarily long distance in perilous conditions. Ironically, this led to actual cannibalism. I tell this story because fear, if understood, is a necessary and useful emotion. They should have been afraid, but they failed to balance their rational fears with their imagined fears. And I fear that this is what we as a society are doing right now. We should be afraid of losing our culture, our beliefs, our self-determination, because those are legitimate fears and we have evidence aplenty that they are being realized. The irrational fears, those that equate a mega hat with a white hood, and the misguided fears, those that shudder at the ego death of the wicked elements of our cultural character. These are the fears that need to be quelled. We must have a rational identity that balances the animalistic urges resulting from our baser fears. This is why the left and the right cannot coexist. One appeals to reason, and the other indiscriminately embraces base instincts. This rationality, understanding historical patterns, human behavior, self-preservation, it can transcend fear. We can also move through it with the teachings of Christianity through an understanding of Satan and of the imp of the mind, through the subjugation of that imp. I know it's so trite to say, but I think it's true. Bravery and courage are not the absence of fear. They're acting rationally while in the midst of it, doing what is right, what is difficult, in the face of fear. If we can do this as a society, harness our fear, let it inform us, suppress our imaginations, and evaluate threats and potential outcomes reasonably, perhaps we can keep this ship afloat and prevent us from eating one another. Thanks, folks, and I'll see you soon. Bye.